everyone. Welcome to the 18th episode of SecuriTEA Crumpets, where we host security professionals each month to talk about different security topics. Today, I'm delighted to have two guest appearances for the first time on SecuriTEA Crumpets, Leif Dreizler and Rachel Landers. Leif has worked in the security space for close to a decade, where he has worked as a security consultant at Redspin, a sales engineer at BugCrowd, and various roles at Segment, now acquired by Twilio, such as staff security engineer and the engineering manager of the security features team. Leif has also helps at conferences like LocoMocoSec, which you can still get tickets for in Hawaii. It's the last week of June, and it has a great lineup of speakers, so you should definitely check that out. Rachel has worked as a product manager at MicroStrategy. She has worked at Segment, where she led enterprise product strategy and also managed other PMs. Rachel is now the product lead at Patch, which attempts to fight climate change with APIs. Welcome, Leif and Rachel. Welcome to the stream.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Stoked to be here.
All right, thank you so much. So, recently on SecuriTEA Crumpets, I've been asking all of my guests if they were to recommend one thing where they're currently living, what would it be? So, I'll start with Leif. Since you've recently started hanging out in New York, what are some of the places you might recommend people to come and visit?
Yeah, New York, there's so much to do. It's truly like an overwhelming amount of things. Coming from California, there's just nowhere that has the same density of stuff. But some of our favorites since moving here are Bond Street Sushi, Thursday Kitchen, and Sbarro.
Sbarro, really? Gourmet pizza.
It's the best pizza in New York.
Oh no, it's gonna get so much hatred now on the internet, I'm sure. Everyone in New York has their own opinion, I'm sure, on pizza.
It is not Sbarro, I will say that.
Cool. All right, and I'll pass it over to Rachel. So you're a Bay resident. What are some of the things you would recommend? And first of all, before we do that, can you show the kind of cool, carpet onto wall situation you have going on over there right now?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I'm in we work in Berkeley right now, and the carpet starts on the floor and then goes all the way up the wall and then stops at the ceiling. I wish it was a carpeted ceiling. That would be pretty trippy, but not quite.
Cool.
My favorite things to do in the Bay Area, I mean, it's room temperature all the time outside. I think that's one of the benefits. And there's also a lot of really cool plant life. So I try to go to the botanical garden in Golden Gate Park as frequently as possible, because every month there's a new crazy flower that's blooming. And it's pretty magical.
I feel like I have to show something now, so I will show my cat.
Just chilling in the window.
Fun fact, he used to be a stray cat and now is hanging out in New York, which is super cool. Okay.
Pretty good life.
She just showed up in our backyard in LA, and we tried to figure out who her owner was, and there was not one, and now it's our cat.
Seeing as I ask everyone, if you ever come to Los Angeles and you want a nice burrito, go to Tacos Tu Madre. It's fantastic. Cool. So let's jump straight into it. So you both worked at Segment. You've both been working in enterprise kind of environments. Kind of like B2B type companies and all that jazz. It would be really interesting to learn some of the potential pain points and woes that you've been having, because obviously there's a lot of, customer asks and various different things that might come in. Like, what are some of the potential pain points that, I guess, let's start with Rachel, that you might see on the enterprise, product management side?
Yeah, and I think we'll probably talk a lot about specific Segment experiences, but something that I found to be especially true at Segment, as Segment was kind of growing from a startup, building for other startups, kind of entering the enterprise space, was we had some pretty noisy and demanding customers. With enterprise customers, you got to get it right the first time, or else you're going to lose faith and trust and lose them as a customer. There are some pretty disparate table stakes features that aren't really required for other customers, but are definitely required for enterprise customers. And a lot of that actually has a lot of overlap with product security. And then I think also, just because enterprise customers are so large, there's a lot of different use cases and personas that you got to solve for kind of all in one, especially with a tool like Segment that can serve so many different use cases because it's so flexible.
Gotcha. I kind of resonate with that. Obviously, just moving into a startup that is supporting lots of different areas of customers, and
Mm-hmm.
they definitely have various different needs. And sometimes, if a company might think something very particular, like you think this might be the right path, but it's actually not the right path for that customer. So you sometimes can lose trust in that way because you've kind of decided to go down one route, which they actually needed something else. So
Yeah, totally.
cool. And then what about yourself, Leif? So you've been working on the security side for a long time. What do you see some of the kind of pain points from your side?
Yeah, I think one of the problems at a startup or just like anywhere that's building things quickly is like there's literally no shortage of good ideas. Like nobody thinks that these security features or like fixes or things related to reliability, like no, if you ask an engineer, nobody would be like, nah, that's a bad idea, we shouldn't do that. It's really more trying to optimize like what should we be building because what is the highest priority. And I know that that is something that PMs think about probably all day and night. And I think that it's something that is kind of like seeping into parts of like the security community and like definitely the engineering community as well. But is like, yeah, it's really not a matter of like trying to convince people that this is a good idea. It's more a matter of like now is the time to spend engineering resources that could be building something else that could make us more money than this thing that you want them to build. And I think security features are kind of an interesting crossover because you actually can make the argument like customers are asking for this, like customers are asking for SSO, customers are asking for SCIM, like, whatever. I think it gets, you have to walk a balanced line between things that are like more on the reliability and security fixes side, where it's like, is this the right time to spend like engineering time to prevent something from happening in the future? Because if you spend your whole time fixing everything and like making everything perfect, your competitors are just going to blow right by you. Like you do
Yeah.
not have time to fix everything, both from a just a normal engineering standpoint, and that also applies to security stuff. Like at the end of the day, security fixes are bugs, just like software has other bugs.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes a lot of sense, and especially when you're moving so quickly, there's just so many pieces that can go wrong, and I think it's better to have like a partnership with different, with your customers and also different teams where you might be able to actually, how do I put this? How do I put this right? It's better to have something which is kind of like half baked to begin with and get feedback than basically just try and think you're going to make this perfect solution that no one actually needs. So.
Yeah, I think that, is heavily tied to what you and Rachel were talking about earlier, where it's like sometimes you build something and like the customer that asked for it, they're like, this is not what we had in mind. Which is like maybe not your fault because like they might have asked for something that wasn't quite right. But yeah, definitely agree that in many cases you want to like iterate. And even for security features, which I think many times are fairly like well understood or well defined, you end up like pulling on this thread where it's like, oh hey, we said we wanted SSO, but we also want SSO exemptions because we have some people that are contractors and they're not in our identity provider, and now we can't enable SSO because we don't want to lock those people out. And so I think that it's, maybe even if you didn't get it wrong, you just end up having them come back at the end and being like, but also this. And you're like, oh, we kind of already allocated time to this project and like we've moved on to the next thing. And it's like, now you want us to go back and spend more time on something, even though we're, down another project.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's move on. So we've talked about some of the problems you may have had in the enterprise space, but so obviously, this is obviously a spoiler. You are speaking at a conference soon, besides San Francisco, where you'll be obviously going more in depth into this realm as well, which we'll definitely share at the end of the stream. But you, Rachel and Leif, you kind of had like a pretty unexpected friendship because obviously generally security is kind of, in my mind, very much siloed in a way. A lot of the time in a lot of organizations, they don't generally get to like touch upon all features or have a pretty good relationship with, with product or etc. So could you talk about how you first met? I know Rachel has a more defined story.
Yeah, yeah. I actually don't know how we like first met, but I remember meeting Leif and thinking that he was really, really friendly. Right when I had first joined Segment and knew nobody, I actually moved to San Francisco for the job at Segment. So it was like new city, new job, first time working for a startup, just like mind blown every minute of every day. And it was there was a holiday happy hour at some like very cool San Francisco bar. And I walked in and was kind of nervous because I didn't really know anybody, and everybody has their little pods of friends and are hanging out. And Leif was the first person to like greet me and treat me with warmth. And I was like, man, I like this guy. He's going to be my friend. And I think we were like standing at the bar waiting for a drink, which is a really, really wonderful place to make a friend. So that's how I remember it. And then we would kind of just, like shoot the shit. Sorry, if you excuse my French, in the hall, and then figured out ways for us to work together.
This is not a family friendly stream, so you can say shoot the shit all you want.
I know,
it's perfectly fine.
Every time I curse, I like imagine my mom's voice in the back of my head being like, "Rach, come on, you know better than that." So
I'm gonna watch the stream and text you.
Yeah.
I think my first 2 days when I joined R2C, I said bollocks on like a recorded meeting that went to the entire marketing teams. That was not, sorry again for saying bollocks, R2C, if you're watching this. So
phenomenal.
So obviously you both met, and obviously you've basically been working together for, well, you obviously no longer because you're working at Patch, but you worked together for a long time. And the one thing I want to kind of start talking about maybe is like, I would love to get your thoughts on this as well, Rachel, is security is generally seen as a blocker versus enabler. And how did that kind of look, from working with the security team at Segment or your previous companies compared to what you may see from either colleagues or counterparts from different teams?
Yeah, totally. And I think I always had a really, really great experience with the security team at Segment, and I'm not just saying that because Leif is on the call. I think sometimes as a PM, like I actually was talking to somebody about this today. As a PM, our job is basically to say no 90% of the time and yes 10% of the time. And that kind of from security. And when I was at Segment, the team that I was product managing for owned a lot of internal services that had a lot of security vulnerabilities. And so sometimes it felt like there was just this like piled up list of needs from security that felt a little bit hard to get through and prioritize against some of the more customer facing features. But I think as time went on and as I understood the security function a little bit more, and Leif and I started kind of collaborating and brainstorming a little bit more, there's actually a fair amount of overlap with product security and like vulnerability patching and enterprise like product value, because like a secure product is an enterprise product and vice versa. And so I think I kind of saw like a transition from the blocker kind of phase that I think a lot of PMs experience with security is like just getting a ticket from Jira or Asana or whatever task you need from the security team, and like that having to be added to your backlog of things to do versus like figuring out how to weave those needs into the roadmap and like find a broader customer benefit for enterprise customers.
Yeah, I think jumping off that, one of the things that I've always been impressed by when working with Rach is the ability to jump on the moving train. I'm not sure if you coined that or if that was maybe Harim.
Maybe Harim or Tito, I can't remember. Yeah. Definitely not mine.
Yeah, I think this is something that's like pretty common at Segment, but is like understanding what all the like outstanding requests are for your team and trying to strategically delay or speed those things up depending on what else you're working on. So it's like, hey, we're going to touch this part of the code base, like let's crush a bunch of the security vulnerabilities or like bugs or whatever that are associated with that part of the code base, even though they might be lower priority. But it's just like it's so much easier to do them now while we're already working on that set of features, rather than like wait until later, when we might get to them from a strict like prioritization standpoint. But I think a lot of the mindset from security at Segment really comes from the leadership and the people that were early on the team, and really the part of the org that we were a part of. So our original org structure was engineering, product design, and security, and those were all like the same tier, I guess. Like they were all part of the same org. Like it was understood that all these groups had to work together. And from the time that I joined, which was pretty early in Segment security like structure, we were part of the foundation team, which was a combination of like security, site reliability, engineering, tooling. And so we really were just kind of part of this other part of the org that was like, hey, we need stuff to function smoothly. Like we need to build reliable software. Security is a component of that. And so I think security and engineering did a really good job of kind of winning the culture war early of like, this is important stuff, like, but also we need to balance it with the fact that the business is doing other things. And so I think you had a good mixture of people that were like modern security folks that, were learning from the community, and also like business minded and were able to understand how their organization fits into the larger business. And it isn't just like, we need to do this because security said we need to do it.
There's like 17,000 things I could ask off of all those kind of tidbits, but it was more some of the things I really kind of like struck out to me was, context switching is really hard, especially in software development. And if you can go and crush a bunch of bugs in, the same kind of piece of code or the same kind of application area, it's going to be super powerful. I see that a lot of the time these days where people are fixing like, let's say like program analysis type things, and if they can like fix them all in one go, it's better to do it in like the TypeScript language versus like, they have to jump to TypeScript then Scala or something like that. So it really resonates with me. And then the one thing I would love to kind of dive more into, which we are going to in this conversation too, is it sounded like early on, everyone was already kind of invested into security, and then you found like getting on the moving train kind of thing as the way to really excel kind of your growth of fixing vulnerabilities, and probably allowing yourself to be more proactive rather than reactive in the long term, because you crush a bunch of things, you think of potential like pathways of reducing that risk in the future. But like, what would you say, like, if an organization that's kind of someone's joining an organization that kind of feels very silos, what are the kind of like a few recommended things that you might recommend to become like a more security enabled type company? No, that's kind of off the cuff, but
no, is this question for me?
Anyone? Yeah, both.
Go for it.
I think we'll get into this a little bit, but I think like a really important aspect, especially when coming into a new company, is to understand where everybody else is kind of coming from, so that you can understand like the why behind a lot of the asks. And so I think going back to the analogy of like a pile of security tickets, like there's a reason there's a pile of security tickets, and there's a benefit to kind of going through them and crushing them. And so I think getting to know the folks on the security team and the security process. So at Segment, we had a pretty well-defined process that it was a lot easier to manage the asks and the task buildup, if you will, after understanding the process and the why behind the ideology of the process. But I think just understanding the why behind the security asks and the like general theme that they could fit in, just to also connect back to this moving train analogy, where if you're building a roadmap, you can again weave in some of these security features or security tasks or security patches, whatever it may be. I think there's a pretty broad spectrum of security product work that can be done, and just trying to figure out how to weave security into your product roadmap as much as possible, especially if you're solving for enterprise customers. Because if you let that pile of security tasks just kind of collect dust on the side, disaster. Just take it from me. You want to definitely continuously improve your security story if you want to win and retain, most importantly, enterprise customers.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think the partnership part is definitely worth expanding on. Like, I think that really goes for any part of a business, like knowing what the other teams that you work with are up to, and like knowing at least a little bit about like how their job works is really helpful. Like maybe if you're in GRC, that's legal. Maybe if you're in security engineering, that's developers. Like I think it also applies like outside of security and engineering for sure. But I think that was one of the things that made it so much easier to work with engineers at Segment, was having a security engineering team that can also write code and like speak the same language as developers. I don't think everyone on your security team needs to know how to code, but if your primary people that you work with outside of your team are developers, it will definitely be very helpful to be able to speak about things in the same terms that they speak in. Just in terms of prioritization and like just conveying your thoughts, it also makes you a little bit more practical when you ask for something. You're just like, oh, I'm not gonna really require you to do things in a really like time consuming way if the benefit is not super high.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely, working in people's environments is very critical for those types of things too. And I know we're going to definitely touch on that in a little bit. So let's talk about some things that, I never thought I would talk about on security and crumpets. But Rachel, I'm really interested. We spoke before this conversation, and you mentioned that your job as a product manager is to be, empathic or empathetic. Can you expand on that? And what does that really mean?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that product managers have to say no to everybody, or at least sometimes it feels that way. I think I'm definitely having one of those weeks. But I think there's maybe a couple different buckets that we can create to talk about what it's like to be an empathetic product manager. Or to be a good product manager, you have to be empathetic, which I believe to be pretty firmly true. And the first is having empathy towards your customers, so to understand the customer problem or the value that you need to solve for or provide to customers, you need to be empathetic to what they're experiencing, what they're going through, what kind of problems you're trying to solve for them with software. The second is you have to have empathy for engineers, because as a product manager, I'm not the one putting my fingers to the keyboard to write the code for the features that I'm kind of pushing out to the market. But I've always worked with a team of engineers who are, and oftentimes projects go in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And PMs have deadlines that they set that engineers may be like, what the hell are you doing? This is not like feasible. I'm working late. I don't like this. And so I think having empathy for engineering is really important as a product manager, so that you can kind of like toe the line of execution and implementation of the features, so that you can bring the value to customers. And then last, you have to have empathy for the whole org. Like I recently have been kind of noodling on this concept of like being a horizontal like business operator. Like PMs are often horizontal, where they're like sort of working with product marketing and with sales and with security and with engineering and with legal, and like just like everybody is a stakeholder internally, but each of those stakeholders have very vertical focuses. Whereas like go to market or sales, like they want to close the deal. Like they want to tell the customer exactly what they want to hear, and that's their goal. And to meet them from where they're coming from, I need to be empathetic to their goal and understand that like if somebody in sales is asking for like a one-off thing to close a deal, like that's a perfectly valid thing, because that's solving for their goal. And to respond to that request in like a meaningful way that kind of appeases everybody, you have to have empathy for where their ask is coming from, so that you can respond appropriately.
I think that security can also probably take a kind of chapter out of that book, because a lot of the time people submit vulnerabilities and they don't really think about the consequences of how much work that actually is for developers. So I definitely can resonate
I feel
with
like be frozen.
Oh, yeah, there is a bit of delay. My connection is unstable again. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, it should be back now. So I basically said, I don't know if you heard it, or it's just, I kind of feel like security could take a kind of chapter out of the empathy book, because a lot of the time someone might find a pretty like a critical vulnerability, or even something they think is important but realistically is low to the business. And trying to get that resolved actually takes a lot of time, a lot of as we talked about, like sometimes doing it all in one chunk on the train kind of thing. But sometimes they're like, well, it needs to get fixed because it's I found it, therefore it's really important. So definitely can understand understanding both sides of the business.
Yeah, literally wearing the other person's shoes. Sorry for talking over you. Go ahead.
No worries. I was just gonna say, I assume you're alluding to like bug bounty in that statement. I think a lot of that just comes from like a lack of experience working at a company, which is totally understandable, because like plenty of people get started in bug bounty and they like might do it for some handful of years. Maybe they're even doing it full time, or maybe they've only worked as like an external consultant. And I think I maybe had a little bit of that attitude as well. Like when I was a consultant, like you'd come through and you'd find some stuff, and then next year you'd find the same stuff. And that was a little bit like disheartening, because you're just like, did the stuff that I did even matter? Like they haven't fixed any of this stuff. But working internally at a company, I think it should, or hopefully it does, give you more appreciation that like there are a lot of things going on in a company, and it's like, yeah, if there's like a critical vulnerability that's there after a year, like that's probably a bad sign. But I think a lot of times people on the outside, they don't totally grasp like the actual severity of this thing. So yeah, I think that's it is definitely frustrating as somebody who has responded to those reports at various points in their life, but it's also something where it's like I kind of just understand at this point that it's like you just haven't had the experiences that I've had that like gives you a different perspective.
I mean, I have seen it also in like larger enterprises where someone will report a vulnerability and it's kind of like, medium severity. And this is obviously internal as well, but it's, there's a lot of cross-functional teams, like lots of various different teams working on the same product. And the only time something actually gets resolved is when an external person finds it. So there's always like that can cause frustration to the security people as well. So I have seen like those types of things, crop up as well outside of just vulnerabilities happen. It's part of the business of writing software, and realistically, there has to be like an agreed or like a good playing field of understanding, like when to kind of just accept that these things kind of are going to get resolved when they eventually get resolved.
And sometimes resolving something is really hard. Like sometimes there's a vulnerability that like this system was just not built in a good way, and it's not a quick like go in and make a handful of lines of code change. Sometimes you're just like, oh, you just really need to rethink how this whole system has been implemented, which can totally understand how something like that would take a long time to resolve.
It's very expensive to fix mistakes that or unintentional mistakes most of the time. It becomes very expensive. I've seen that happen firsthand. So I think what would be really good so obviously I think Rachel talked about a lot of good points, but obviously we talked about the silo effect where security or maybe product might not be able to talk to each other, but I feel like you've both had a lot of success working cross-functionally. And what are some of the techniques that you've seen that allow you to kind of accomplish and work quicker and more efficiently through empathetic working?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one. I think working cross-functionally is really important, basically for any team. Like if you think about a company delivering something really important, it's pretty rare that there's just like one team that does everything. Typically, if you're delivering something that's really important to your customers, it's going to require some amount of like coordination and comms like throughout the business. So it's a really good skill to have. But I think as somebody who's working on a security team, I definitely have benefited from the fact that Segment is a B2B company. And as Rach has mentioned, like we're targeting enterprise customers. Enterprise customers care about this. It's a lot easier to make friends with product people when you can truthfully go to them and say, hey, our biggest customers that pay us a ton of money really care about this stuff. So like we need to care about it too. It's like that's a language that every product manager speaks. And so definitely harder if you're in like a B2C space where like I would say the stakes are not quite as high. Unfortunately, just like your end customer doesn't care the same way that like B2B business does. But I think some of the stuff that really helped us was like actually getting our hands dirty and fixing some vulnerabilities. Like I don't think you want to cultivate a situation where it's like, oh, security found this, their job to fix it, even though it's not their code base. But like just fixing some stuff is pretty helpful because it just teaches you a lot about how software is built and deployed at your company. And then for us, some of the early things that we did was we just worked on some smaller security features. Stuff like the first thing that I worked on was our password strength meter. That's mostly like a visual indicator that uses the Dropbox ZXCVBN library and Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned API. And just with those two things, you can meet the NIST guidance for passwords. So you can move away from the like one uppercase, one lowercase, one number, one symbol, and move towards something where somebody can just use like a variety of strong password strategies. So that was an early one. And then we've had various projects over the years that have just kind of, given us a better understanding of engineering, giving engineers a better understanding of like some stuff that is cool to offer to your customers. And I think just through that partnership of actually like working on features together and delivering stuff was a really good way to build that relationship. And the team Rachel was formerly on and my team, we've been working on stuff like semi-continuously for the last like couple of years for various projects, which has been awesome.
And I want to just flag and highlight what Leif said about speaking the language of a product manager. I think that like really definitely hit the nail on the head for me when we first started working together, where Leif was kind of like always ideating on different ways that security features could benefit customers. And when he would come to me and be like, hey, like this thing exists that you might not know about because you're not like a security professional, and it would bring XYZ benefit to customers, like my ears perked up immediately and I was down for the conversation. So I think, and to expand, like that's true of interacting, empathizing, collaborating across any team from A to B, where you just need to understand like what are their goals, what kind of processes do they use, and how do they work? Because I think fitting into that is also really, really important. Whereas like in the product world, we have a backlog of ideas that we kind of groom and maintain over time. And so if anything new comes, we throw it in the backlog and then we can continue kind of like collecting feedback and tagging it to that. And that's really important to fit into our process, because if we have just like one-off ideas floating in like the Slack abyss or something like that, then it probably isn't going to get prioritized and isn't going to have the eventual effect that maybe somebody wants it to have.
Yeah, I think that's something that security is getting better at, is like making things easy for other teams. Like the goal as a security team should really be to make things secure and easy. I think Netflix has done a really good job talking about this at various points. But the idea of like creating a paved path is very much in line with that idea of like, hey, how do we make it easy for people to make good security choices? And I would say building security product features is maybe a little bit different, but it is still related to what Rach said of like, hey, go to a team, show them that you kind of understand how they work and how they operate, and it's going to be a lot easier to get them to, you know, listen to you and consider working with you.
Yeah, it definitely, if you can kind of like bridge the gap and make things a tiny bit easier for each team, especially like if like let's say like I know that I'm one of those instigators that I find a lot of like things that I think would be really important to like fix, at least in my mind, not necessarily important to the business. But it's like, you know, you still should share those things anyway, because again, they can go to a backlog and they can sit there and kind of manifest, and then eventually 5 ideas could turn into one great idea kind of thing. So I think that's, you know, but obviously report it in their way. Don't just, you know, put it in language that doesn't really resonate with the business. And yeah, I think that's really important. So I know we kind of touched on this, but I would love to get your, you know, thoughts on other ways that, you know, we've talked about, you know, kind of like understanding and cross collaboration. And you did talk about like early features early on, or like working on features and fixing vulnerabilities, Leif. But what are other ways security engineers or people in security that could potentially get more involved with like the product side of the business?
I think one thing that's good is just trying to pay attention during like all hands and quarterly planning, and just kind of keeping an ear out for like when folks are working on stuff. This goes back to the jumping on the moving train idea that we were talking about a little bit earlier, is like, oh, I heard that this team is going to be working on this thing over the next like few months. Like, let me check our list of like security vulnerabilities and maybe like suggest.
Sorry, just an FYI, there's been a tiny delay in the stream. Testing, testing. Okay, I think I can hear you again. Sorry, this is the first time this has happened. At least maybe Zoom isn't happy with me.
Did you want me to repeat that last answer?
Yeah, I literally heard none of it. So.
No worries. Yeah, so I think jumping back to the like the moving train idea, I think a good way is just to stay informed about what your org's working on, whether it's like reviewing quarterly planning docs or like going to all hands or whatever. That's a great time to suggest, you know, to other teams like, hey, you're already doing this. Like, could you maybe sneak in a few of these like existing security vulnerabilities, you know, like to fix those like as you're working on stuff. I think really anything that your team does can be an opportunity to meet people, like whether that's training or whether that's a design review or a threat model. It's like, think of all of those things where you're interacting with coworkers as a way to like make a new friend that's not part of the security org.
And the one thing I've seen work recently on Slack is like using like the donor app and stuff. Like that's pretty interesting to be able to like talk to different people outside of your team. Like I've had various different conversations that I didn't expect to have, and then it led into like some pretty productive things of how we could work better with sales or work better with marketing or those types of things. So I think definitely jumping into like maybe like people's all hands occasionally and listening to what they're doing, which you said I think is really smart. And now I will spin it and ask Rachel, like, what other ways product can get involved with security?
Yeah, I think my answer is just stand at the bar at the holiday party until you meet somebody on the security team. No, just kidding. It was pre-pandemic days. Yeah, I think I would echo kind of everything that Leif just said. I think most B2B software companies are going to have some sort of security vulnerability process. So if you're a product manager at a B2B SaaS company, you are likely getting an influx, maybe small or large, of requests from the security team. I think like an easy recommendation that's a little bit more async is to understand kind of who's driving those requests. Like it might be some external source that's doing some sort of pen testing on particular features or otherwise, but I think understanding who's driving the requests and prioritizing them is a really good friend to have, so that if potentially this is like a cute or minor use case, so like if a request comes in that you maybe don't understand or don't think is a priority, it's good to start having those conversations with people on the security team that might be able to explain the priority or like illuminate some context that you might not have, not being a security professional. And so I think a really good way to start it is just to open dialogue. And I think we're all very busy and we all have our own priorities, et cetera. But I personally, in this remote working world, love meeting new people. And I think it's really, really nice and fun and clarifying to like start conversations with people about things that may be happening in like your async or like task oriented side of work. And so I think that could be like a pretty good way to start. I think Andy, who used to work at Segment, who I think has been on this podcast and was on Leif's team, my like working relationship with Andy started up on Slack because what I was describing, whereas Andy and I would Slack about security vulnerabilities and I would build a little bit of trust with him, where if Andy said it was a priority, then it was worth fixing because he and I kind of built a rapport with each other on how to think about security features and security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I think that goes both ways too. Is like you as a security person should also be willing to trust an engineer or a product person that can demonstrate why something is a different priority. Like you might think something is a certain priority, but you might not know all the factors at play. And so you should also be willing to negotiate a little bit on priority when it makes sense.
Yeah.
So you're not going to see this, but the stream will. There is a blog post that you released, I believe last year, called Shifting Engineering Right. And obviously that's a very different concept that everyone generally talks about, because everyone says you should shift left. But part of that blog post, you talk about cultivating engineering buy-in. And could you kind of talk about, the types of things that you generally like did at Segment to kind of move that forward? Things like, putting a security, like someone embedded into a different team, for example, or like how do you kind of get people to cultivate security buy-in?
Yeah, so in that blog post, it was specifically about like, building security features, and really kind of for people that haven't read it, which is, probably a lot of you. I would like the one sentence version is like, yes, it's good to shift security left, but like we should also be shifting engineering right. And if you're an engineer, a software security person that works commonly with software engineers, like you should know how to do at least a subsection of their job. And so some of the things, like we've already talked about some of the things that we've done to cultivate engineering buy-in. Like I think that really just like trust, like building relationships, using every interaction as an opportunity to meet people are great. We had a lot of success sending somebody, in many of the early cases, it was me, to an engineering team to actually build something collaboratively. And so we built our MFA system together. That was like one of the earlier ones, where I built most of the back end, and then somebody else built kind of the like more front end stuff. And then we rebuilt our authentication service together, and then we built SCIM. And so I think a lot of teams are receptive when there's another team that's like, hey, we care enough about this that like we're willing to, essentially donate one of our full-time engineers or multiple full-time engineers to helping you do this thing, because it shows that you're like, super invested in this. And as mentioned earlier, like people from my team, have been working with people from Rachel's old team for a while, and have done some pretty awesome work, and they're continuing to do some really great projects together.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so previously we talked about we had up before this stream we talked about like taking a plane and basically making it fly higher, which I think Rachel was saying. So I think part of that is basically finding friends inside different, I guess cross-functional teams. And then once you found those friends, like what do you generally need to succeed? Like to basically, you have all these ambitious plans now that, all your friends are inside the team is like thinking about doing. What can you do from both the product and the security side to actually kind of like push features or ideas forward?
I think it's important to note that you have to start like ideating first. Like you have to generate the ideas first. And I think in order to do that, you have to like understand both sides of the equation. So for security, you need to understand how to speak the product language, as Leif was saying earlier. And for product, you need to understand how security fits into your product strategy. Or again, if you're working with enterprise customers, it is the product strategy as far as I'm concerned. It's like security and scalability are like the two big buckets that I think we could maybe simplify enterprise product development into. Might be too simple, but I don't know. And so I think just like maybe having like a brainstorming session or having a shared backlog where you can just like async throw some ideas in, flagging customer feedback that you get in that could be security related, sending it to the security team, being like, what do you think of this? Is this something that we should build? I think just treating security in the same way that like most product managers will treat the engineering teams that they're working with, where like an idea comes in, you're like, hey, is this hard? Like, would this take a really long time to build? It sounds like a really great idea. It would bring a lot of business value, but is it enough business value to justify the cost of actually building it? And I think security can like really fill that seat when talking about security features. And that's kind of something that you need to start having dialogue about, because it's a constant iterative process to develop software.
The security team's also great for when you're trying to build an enterprise security feature, because somebody on your security team's probably used it. Like when I sign into various systems, is like I think about how their 2FA system works. Like I've set up Okta for a ton of apps at various points in my career. Like I have seen really good implementations of SSO. I've seen stuff that's like, this is totally janky on security features.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's say you have your engineering team is like, yep, that sounds like a great idea. Maybe it'll take like 2 weeks worth of work, or maybe like a month or something of engineering time. Like, what is the general approach that you've seen to be successful for the cross collaboration components, like documentation, etc., and scope docs, those types of things?
Oh yeah, I can start just because I think all PMs love writing docs, because it's like, okay, I said our entire job is saying no. It's saying no and writing docs about why we're saying no. Just kidding. It's a lot more than that, I promise. I think. No, I think the first step is always just to like evaluate the opportunity and do a little bit of data analysis. So I think in the examples of how Leif and I have worked together, we'll all often do a little bit of digging through our customer data, not like their personal information, but like how our customers are using the product. So an example of this is we did an analysis to figure out which customers were using what SSO connections, or what IDPs rather, and just to like analyze where we necessarily needed to like put our investment into a product relating to IDPs. And I think that getting the opportunity assessment, the potential revenue impact, the customer impact, the value, et cetera, and codifying it in a product requirements document or an opportunity assessment is like always the first step. it serves both as like a validating document of, yes, this is something that we need to do, and yes, this is the right time, but also kind of like a grounding or foundational artifact that the security team can look at and see and understand what's happening. The product team can understand what's happening, any other business stakeholders, and the engineering team that would be collaborating on the feature, just to like make sure that everybody is on the same page. This is what it is, this is why it's important, and this is why now is the time to build, is generally the best first step. Just alignment all around, basically.
Cool. Then I'll pass it over to Leif. Like, what do you do like once you see those product requirements docs? Like, what happens next once, you know, from your side?
Yeah, so it could be the case where you do the analysis and you're like, hey, actually, this isn't the time to build this, or like, oh, maybe there isn't as much demand for this thing as we thought. Or, you know, maybe now you have a very sound use case or a business case for like, yeah, this is something that we should be doing. And then from there, you can kind of get into the like buy-in and like planning phase where you're like, okay, we've generally agreed that like doing this thing is a good idea. Like, how are we actually going to do it? I actually really like writing docs too. Maybe that's like the sliver of a PM in me, but like I love like writing a bunch of stuff out and then like having other people that are like smarter than me or you know, just as smart as me, like take a look and be like, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea. Like you know, it'd be probably easier if you did this, or like, you know, asking insightful questions like, what about X, Y, and Z? It's also a good opportunity to do research. Some of the stuff that has been really like research heavy for me is like, we did a lot of JWT stuff with our authentication service, and I read a lot of the like RFCs about JWTs to make sure that we were like doing things in a reasonably sensible way. And then same thing with SCIM. It's like, oh, building SCIM, it's like, oh, there's 3 RFCs. It's like, just follow those as best you can, and you're probably going to have something that's compatible with what the identity providers are expecting. And so I think that you know, the research phase is really important afterwards. And I love the, you know, the like adage like weeks of programming can save hours of planning. Like I think that that's why it's really important to like spend you know, the appropriate amount of time up front. Like certainly there's things you're just gonna naturally uncover as part of the building process, and that's kind of why engineering is fun. But I do think there's a lot of stuff that you could avoid with like thorough research up front.
And then I've been slowly like adding like something from one of your previous presentations from from last con, where it's metrics Maketh Man, and I've just been slowly popping it up over my face, so that looks I'm sure that's been freaking people out a little bit. But I think that's probably like leading into kind of what we've been talking about, and obviously you're doing research and all these different things. Like, how have like the metrics like worked to help you get like security features prioritized? Has it been like the kind of like the selling point most of the time, or like, you know, could you have got away with it without doing that? Or yeah.
I can maybe take a stab, Leaf, unless you want to go. I think for the bigger features, and I also think that the amount of due diligence needed beforehand is directly related to how large the feature is, or how much time or investment it's going to take to get it to customers. I think generally like some amount of data analysis ahead of time is pretty important for anything that you build. I think the security team, and I'll let Leif talk about this, also had some sort of like priority scale that they would set for security vulnerabilities that were based off of things in addition to like customer impact, and metrics is also kind of like security impact. But I will let Leif maybe explain that.
Yeah, I think the metrics are really important because it just shows you where to invest in, and like it shows you that you made either a good or a bad investment. Like one of the, I think a great example is like going back to the guest Andy Lee. He talked about our internal service access service. For those of you that haven't heard of it, basically it's just an internal tool that allows you to get time-based peer-reviewed access. So like I could ask an engineering manager that like manages a tool to give me access, rather than having to like go through IT asks them anyway, and then, you know, IT goes back and provisions me. I think like one thing that would be really interesting there is like, how long does it take on average for a request to get approved? How long did it take in the, you know, the IT only system? How long does it take with access service? Like maybe it's still a little longer than you want. Like how can we make that easier? Maybe we should invest in approvals via Slack or whatever. Like, I think that having metrics as a baseline is a really good way to show like, hey, this thing is, too expensive or too fast or too slow or whatever. And then you can make some changes and, see if things are going in the right direction. Some metrics are a little bit more like, hey, we just want to know how many people are using this, and then we want to tie that to a dollar amount, and that's enough. So yeah, it's a combination of like having the right data and then kind of knowing like what, like anything, how much time do you actually spend like generating these metrics? Because it's like anything else, like creating these things takes time. That's time you could be doing something else. Like you need to figure out like what's the appropriate balance for metrics for these features. But I will generally say that if it's a customer facing feature, being able to tie that to a dollar value like never is a bad idea.
I would agree. So getting close towards the end, and I have a couple of questions remaining. So, you've kind of talked about security features that they're table stakes for winning enterprise customers in some of your previous like either like presentations or blogs. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit more? I know we've kind of talked about it in general, but if you could just summarize it.
Yeah, I think enterprise customers, maybe to summarize it, enterprise customers are a little bit more sophisticated than like the mid-market or small business startup customers, and have more compliance requirements. And that could be related to the fact that there are like IT and security teams at enterprise businesses whose sole responsibility is to make sure that there's no sort of data leak, there's no funny business happening with any of the SaaS products that they've decided to leverage across the entire organization. And so oftentimes in the enterprise sales process, there's something called an RFP, which is request for proposal, that almost every sales team has to fill out, or sales engineering team has to fill out when they're trying to sell to an enterprise customer. And a big portion of that is questions from the IT teams asking about the security features in place. And that is essentially a gate where like you either have the security functionality that is required by the enterprise or you don't. And if you don't, you're out of the running. Like the RFP is a failure and you won't close the deal. And so I think there are the gate features that are table stakes, like truly like you need to have these in order to sell to enterprises. And then there are the maybe differentiators, which are things like SCIM that isn't necessary to have a secure product, but is necessary for IT teams to do their jobs effectively and scale access management within a particular piece of software, because they're managing not just this one like software type, they're managing across multiple different software offerings for all the different teams within the business. And so I think things like that will help close deals, retain deals, scale usage, because the IT teams are comfortable with the software that they're not necessarily using for their end goal, but they are responsible for managing. And so I think security can kind of fit into the like acquisition funnel of like, do you have the feature in the RFP or not? And then also like the retention and growth funnel of like, are you building for IT teams? Because they're the first stakeholder that you have to touch in order to scale or grow the usage of your product.
Yeah, definitely. And like the last thing you want to be as a security team is a team that costs a salesperson a deal. I guess it's not security specific, like that probably goes for any engineering team. But I think probably like the second worst thing to losing a deal is getting told you need to build something in like a tight time window. Like luckily this didn't happen for us, but it's like I know of companies that have been told like you need to build SSO in 90 days or something like that. And having to build a security feature quickly and like disruption to like the roadmap and like all that stuff is like the second to last thing that you want to do, with the last one being like the deal just getting lost outright. So yeah, those are definitely like both bad scenarios that you want to avoid. And I would also make the argument that like the security features are really like kind of just a way to showcase that you're investing in security overall. Like I think there's probably a pretty good correlation between like overall security spend and like richness of features, at least in the B2B space. Like I think it's very different in B2C, but like I would find it pretty unlikely that a company is spending a ton of money or spending very little money on security, but spending a lot of money on security features.
This has actually been like, someone who just generally lives in security land, it's really interesting to like see the different side, especially when, you both have been in like enterprise for so long. It's really informative. I have one final question and then I will let you enjoy your wonderful It's Wednesday today, right? So I've actually never heard this term before, but I saw it. And how is drinking your own champagne, or as what other people generally say, eating your own dog food, like helped solidify product ideas in your kind of previous experience?
I like drinking champagne better than eating dog food,
Significantly better.
personally.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Yeah,
get rid of dog food.
Way
Is
more appetizing.
dog food is crossed out now. It's just champagne completely. Yeah.
totally. I can take this one first, I guess. I feel like I've been jumping
I
really
mean,
fast, so I apologize. But
yeah, go for it.
I think at Segment in particular, we definitely eat our own dog food. Segment provides like tons of product teams, customer insights, and so every feature that we shipped, we also had like a Segment analytics tracking plan kind of aspect associated with the scope of the feature, so that we could track adoption. And so I think in using the features that we're building, and even sometimes using the features like as we were building them, in the case of like access management or more of the security related features, I think it was really helpful to understand like the pain points that we could be additionally causing because we were building these really complex scaled features. And so there's always going to be edge cases that maybe we're not considering as we're scoping, designing, building, etc. And so I think drinking your own champagne not only allows you to like physically empathize with how your customers are using your feature, just to kind of go back to the original point, but also I just lost my train of thought. Empathize with what your customers are experiencing, but also like test and find those edge cases that may exist and enable yourself to iterate a little bit deeper and build your roadmap a little bit like stronger.
Yeah, it's a huge benefit. Like, I feel so spoiled that I've been able to work somewhere at Segment where like your own product is so applicable to your own use cases. Like, imagine working somewhere where it's like you're building a point of sale system for like a restaurant. Like, you'll probably never be, you might be the end customer, but it's like you're never going to be the restaurant owner. So it's like you're never going to just encounter those like random bugs or quirks from using your product. And so yeah, I definitely feel very fortunate that like we've been able to use Segment so much on the security team, because it has made us way more data driven. Like, being able to use Segment's analytics libraries to
Oh. This is very unfortunate. Okay, we'll be back in a second. Every time it says your connection's unstable, it brings back. Looks like we're back. Are we back?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the last thing you heard?
Segment Analytics Library.
Yeah, so we've been really fortunate that we get to use Segment's own analytics library, because it's allowed us to be much more data driven, because we can actually instrument the stuff that we're building. Whether that's a customer facing feature or an internal application or a service or whatever, is like, we know how many accounts we turned on MFA for. We know how many customers are using SSO. And so it's allowed us to much more easily be a very data-driven and like product-focused team, because we can build the same stuff that engineers build in terms of like Snowflake dashboards. Like, we can just go in and, I can tell you how many customers are doing this thing that we're tracking.
Awesome. So I know we've reached time, so obviously I want to be very respectful of both of your time, because I'm sure you have lots of things to do today. I do want to give you like a minute or 30 seconds to talk about the upcoming places you're speaking or conferences in general. So I'll either pass it to Leif or Rachel to do that.
Yeah, I can take that. So Rach and I are teaming up to speak at B-Sides SF, which is the first weekend of June in San Francisco, obviously. I'm very excited to be there. That was actually the first conference I spoke at in 2015, so kind of cool to be back as a speaker as a number of years. The topic will be similar to this, but we have slides, we have data, we have other things to talk about. We're actually going to walk through the process of building SCIM at Segment, which I think people might find pretty cool. And then we'll be around the conference after the presentation if you want to talk to us in person. And then I'll also throw another quick note for LocoMocoSec, which is in late June. It has 2 days of training, 2 days of conference, and it is in Hawaii. Very nice place to be. I help organize that, and we have a really fantastic lineup of speakers and trainers. And so if you want to go out and listen to some amazing talks, we are still looking for sponsors, and we're also still looking for attendees. So let us know. It's a great single track conference.
That's what I was just about to say. The single track is definitely the largest selling point because everyone actually has something to talk about. So again, Rachel and Leif, thank you so much for today. This has been super informative for me. I think a lot of this information I'm going to be reusing probably internally where I work, and I hope other people do the same. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah,
Thanks
I'm
for
happy to
having
chat
us.
with the folks internally too, if that would be helpful.
100%. So this was episode 18 of Security and Crumpets. See you potentially in a few weeks for the follow-on.